There it is.
Awesome, thanks, Joe. Okay, hi everyone. Okay, that is really loud, crikey. Adrian and I are very happy to be here. We've come all the way from Vancouver. I was here about 10 years ago to talk to you guys about something to do with data limited fish. I can't remember what it was. Today, as Chip pointed out, you're moving, or at least investigating, a different way of doing business, management, strategy, evaluation. My job over the course of the next half an hour or so is to give you a as clear as possible description of what that is and what it means to you, but also what the advantages could be to you in your current situation, and also basically what things we really need from you guys to make sure that this thing could be as beneficial as possible to you. Just a brief bit of background. I'm an adjunct professor at UBC, but we left to start a consultancy, Blue Matter. Both Adrian and I are directors. And we basically developed software and solutions for doing this. So, you know, we obviously have bought into this idea. And so I hope this doesn't sound like a sales pitch, but we actually have seen the advantages of this idea for a lot of fisheries. And hopefully we can try and convey some of that to you guys today. So what is this thing? There's three parts. I'll talk about what it is. The second part is useful to talk about how MSE differs from stock assessment, because people are really familiar kind of with the idea of stock assessment, and that usually clarifies a few issues. But it's all very well known what something is and how it differs from stock assessment, but what does the actual process look like? If we have to go through it, what are the steps, and where does your feedback come in, and stuff like that? So just three parts to this presentation. Let's start with section number one. The thing I would say though, is we're really here for you guys today. So there's gonna be a chance throughout this presentation for you guys to ask questions. Stick your hand up and say, Tom, that doesn't make any sense to me. What do you want about? Or I think this is a really serious problem that I care about. Please do that. Please stop us and share your concerns or ask a question. We're here for you guys, so do that. Don't feel shy at all. Okay, so our first step in this description of what MSE is to draw a very simple diagram of what a fishery system is. And this is the real one, the one that you guys know, that's actually happening in reality. And in this black box that I've labeled fishery is all the stuff that you guys know is happening out on the water, okay? This is creatures growing, dying, reproducing, moving offshore as they grow older, you guys going out there on boats, catching them, different sizes, all the stuff that happens out there in reality in that fishery is happening here. Where they live, all that stuff is happening in that black box. And as you know, we collect data, we observe that system, and that's what happens in that blue box. And that could be fishery independent surveys, recreational trip data, you name it. Some kind of size sampling program that you've got, tagging, I don't know what you have yet. We're here for a lot of that. But that's in that blue box. That's how we observe what's going on in the water. And our scientists and managers have a set of assessment and other rules for interpreting those data and saying what we should do to manage that fishery. That's what's happening in that red box. They're interpreting those data, they're providing advice, and that is then enforced in some way or other. And of course, it feeds back into the fishery. And this is kind of what most fisheries management systems look like. The real dynamics, the data, the management, enforcing that thing on the water, and then it feeds back into the dynamics of the fishery, that black box. So it's kind of like a loop that we go round and round and round doing, typically on an annual or every 2-year basis, depending on the species. No big mystery, right? But the question is, why are we doing what we're doing, right? Like, why don't we like spend loads of time agonizing over models and making them more and more complicated and coming up with really complicated rules for setting management advice, and spend less time on data and less time on enforcement? Or why don't we do the opposite? Why don't we collect an absolute ton of data, spend some time doing assessment, and then not really worry about enforcement? Why are we doing what we're doing? And so, and this could include the type of assessment, or the type of rule, or the type of data as well. It's not just the amount, it's like what things you actually collect. Why are we doing what we're doing? One of the more interesting things to realize when you go around and you deal with many different fisheries is that we could definitely benefit from a clearer statement about why we're doing what we're doing. Not just this is what we've always done, this is what they do in fisheries like ours, but a much clearer statement about what our strategy is and what we're trying to achieve, which allows people like you guys to say things like, I want more access and I can make these kind of management changes. Therefore, to achieve that, we should do this. And it's not up to guesswork. There's a calculation that's made and a decision comes out of it and everyone knows where that came from. Imagine a world like that, right? But as it turns out, that doesn't sound very good, that first paragraph, but there's good reasons why we haven't been able to be as transparent and open about how we make decisions. And here's what that reason is. I mean, the first thing is we could do an actual experiment. You could take those boxes and in reality change them, right? So here we've got the same boxes, but you've got at the top a real fishery operating. To the right, you've got some port sampling, collecting data. At the bottom, you've got a bunch of nerdy scientist types like me building an assessment model, and then you've got them enforcing on the water, okay? What's the problem with experimentation in a fishery? Well, first of all, it could just be dumb luck, right? Like you could set up a new data program, a new assessment rule, just get a huge influx of recruits and go, yeah, we're doing a great thing. You've only got one replicate, you've only got one fishery, so you'll never know whether it was really your experimental intervention or whether or not it was just the natural system. Also, it's going to take you a long time potentially to see the impact, and you may not be able to like test many different ideas at the same time. You're stuck, right? What if you've got 12 different things you want to try? You want to have a size limit, you want to try a spatial closure, you want an access limit. You don't have 200 years of experimentation to do that with, right? So what do we do? What do humans do now when it's just not feasible to do experimentation? We do simulation. Here we've got a pilot on the left who's getting tested in a helicopter simulation. And he's going to get tested under a wide range of circumstances that are super tough. Like he's going to get crosswinds, he's going to get night flying, he's going to get thunderstorms. The focus here is on the pilot. We're going to work out whether or not he's got the skills to survive regardless of what the weather conditions are going to be like. We've got an F1 driver on the right. Very, very expensive track time. So instead, they're going to train him up and test him over all the conditions he might find in a real race, but they're going to do it on a simulator where it's cheap. He can get out and have a coffee and get back in again. They're going to do all that stuff and not have to do this unfeasible thing of real world experimentation. Why don't we do that in fisheries, right? Fisheries is just a system like any other. Why don't we test our ideas first to make sure they make sense? To make sure they can pass these tests, that what we're proposing for management is a good idea. And that's basically all that MSE is, right? Like it's really simple, actually. It's exactly what you've just seen. Every single one of those boxes is just done on a computer. That's it. The thing that black box we call the fishery, well, that's just called the operating model. It's just a fancy word for the systems that you guys all know is happening on the water, but just on a computer. That's it. It's just part of a calculator, okay? The thing where we collect data, and that's called an observation model, that just makes sure that the types of data that you guys actually gather and work with are created in the same type, same sparsity, same quality that you really see them. The thing down here in the red box, it takes in data and out comes advice. So anything, any rule that you guys want to come up with accepts data and says we should do this. It's called a management procedure. So this is just terminology at this point. And the part of it that implements that advice is called the implementation model. That deals with how perfectly those recommendations are taken in the real world and in the real system. So what it actually is, MSE is just what you know in a fishery, but it's making a calculator for testing ideas for data types, management procedures, enforcement, but also the black box. It's testing how well those work, just like the pilot, under stressful situations or situations you think could happen, but you're not sure. It's really not a complicated idea, MSE, at all. It's a pain in the butt to program it, but to run it and to understand it is really not complicated. Sometimes people call management procedures harvest strategies. That's another word for that red box. Sometimes people care about the whole thing, the data you collect, the rule you use to provide advice, and how you would enforce it. Those are all the things you do as managers, and that altogether is sometimes referred to as a management strategy, the overall strategy for what you're going to do. Management procedures can be things like stock assessments. Like if you take your advice from a stock assessment, yeah, that could be, and a rule that could be considered a management procedure. You'll hear us talk about OMs, that's just abbreviation for an operating model, and you'll hear us talk about MPs, that's just your management procedure. And if I haven't mentioned it already, your management procedure can be just about anything. It could be a quota, it could be a TAC limit, a size limit, a spatial closure. It could be something to reduce discard mortality. It could be access, number of days on the water. It could be a combination of all those things. So the thing you do in that red box, the type of advice you give can be a combination of lots of different things if you want it to be. So let's just say we take a leap of faith and we say, oh, we believe our stock assessment. And I'll put my hand up and tell you that I'm a stock assessment skeptic, okay, in general. But let's imagine that you say we believe our stock assessment. Let's create an operating model. Let's just believe the scientists for a second and say, well, here's our operating model. It's going to look like our stock assessment. That could be one scenario for an operating model, just one. And we would like to set let's say a TAC for the sake of argument, based on your fishery independent survey or something like that. That could be one management procedure. Of course, this thing goes around in a loop. We're gonna do this in the future. We're gonna go around in a circle, allowing the data to be sampled from that operating model, us to provide advice, and that feed back into, just like it does in the real world, back into our dynamics. And we can monitor things like catch and biomass. So if you look, as we go around, we've got an annual record of what really happened, the catch that was really taken, the biomass that was really taken in the real world, in the simulation, as it were. In this simulation, we can see what the outcome was. And so we just carry on going round and round into the future for a number of years, testing this index-based management procedure. Does it respond to I think we're just off our presentation now, right there. Let's see if we're back. Yeah, I think whatever, okay, we're back, it's fine. That's cool. And so we can then, of course, without having to do this thing in the real world of experimentation, where we never really know whether it was chance or not, we can replay that whole experiment again with that whole idea again with a different strategy. What would have happened if we'd done exactly the same in here, 6 years of projection, but using this other rule that you guys are interested in, this other management system, using different data? What would have happened? And so we can compare now a new management procedure in the box, it's green now, and see how well they'd have done in terms of catch and biomass. Is this a better idea to use, in this case, mean length and an index to inform your management? So you can compare simultaneously on a level playing field different management options, and at the end of it, say why you might pick one over another. It's not a bad starting point for suggesting a management change or an alternative management approach or something like that, and everybody can see why you got there. But maybe more importantly than that is that you can change the box. Like, what if you guys don't believe the stock assessment too well, or you think there's going to be climate change, or you include your pet theory about what you think is going to happen in the system? Maybe you think discarding is going to become less of an issue or more of an issue. Create a new version for that black box and test to see whether there's any difference in the management procedure you would pick. This is a really important issue. What matters? What matters? Does what matter what's actually going on in the world, the weather forecast, or does what matter whether your pilot is going to fly well under all those circumstances? The focus here is not on the forecast. Focus here is on the pilot. Does your management procedure, do you have confidence that your management procedure that's being recommended can work regardless of what's in this orange or this black box, these alternative scenarios? MSE is not about the truth. It's about having confidence that you've got a management system that's strong, that's robust, that will get what you want. That's the focus. And because we go round and round in this loop, and because there's feedback between the management procedure and the operating model, just like there is in reality, this is sometimes called closed loop simulation. You'll hear people say that. All that is just say that it's going round and round in this circle and there's feedback. It sounds technical, but that's all they mean. I'm going to bombard you with a bunch of references. This is really for later in case any of you guys are interested to know this, but the take-home message for the next 2 slides is that MSE has been around since the 1980s. It's used today in a very wide range of different fisheries, and it has solved a number of problems that people face when they're trying to manage a fishery resource. And I'll tell you about a few of those problems. So way back in the day, in the 1980s, Carl Walters and Ray Hilborn basically decided that to learn about what a resource is like, to know how resilient it is, to know how big it is, you might have to have deliberate changes in the way you manage it. You might have to hammer it, for example, and see how quickly it responds, or ease off and see how quickly it recovers, whatever. And that was called adaptive management. But to know what suitable adaptive management should be, like how much to hit something on the head or not, to learn, they needed simulations, they needed operating models. And at the same time, the very first management procedure was put in place in South Africa for anchovy and sardine. So in the 1980s, this idea of having a basis for how you were going to manage something by using a computer simulation came about. And since then, it's been used for all kinds of things. Some of the biggest and most established ones relate to whales and things like southern bluefin tuna. And I've just listed here a whole bunch of creatures. But the point here, short-lived, long-lived, reef fish, invertebrates, you name it, people have used management strategy evaluation. It's pretty well established now. So what problems does it solve? Well, you've seen that system going around. Well, one thing that people are worried about is that we're basing all of our advice on one idea about what's going on in the system. One idea. There could be a stock assessment, but they might say, well, we actually don't really know. It could be any of these things. So how do you build that into advice? Well, in MSE, you just make sure your management procedure works for all of those things. The onus is not on knowing, it's on just knowing that your management procedure will work. So it solves that issue of high uncertainty over what's really going on in your fishery. It can solve that. Another way has always been a debate about how to interpret data. So for something like Southern Bluefin tuna, there was out and out war at one point between two different stakeholder groups because they just, one believed one index of abundance and the other one didn't. So they created two operating models and they made sure their advice would work for both. And then everyone went home, discovered it wasn't really an issue after all. There's lots of good reasons to think about taking this approach. So we'll take a break because basically, if you followed any of what I said, you now basically know what MSE is and what the idea is. So this would be a good time if you've got questions about that to bring them up. Yeah.
All right, any questions for Tom with relation to understanding what he just presented to get better clarity for yourself? Jimmy?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. This will be the first of many questions probably, but so you just stated that an MSE can solve high uncertainty. Well, we have high uncertainty in the South Atlantic on just about, all of our snapper grouper stocks in the assessment and in the data. And so I think the way you solve the high uncertainty is because you simulate all the different scenarios that could happen and figure out the plan that can handle all of them. Is that correct?
That is basically it, just that. But moreover, what if I could show you that half of those made no difference to how you would choose a management procedure? Then we can worry about the ones that do matter, right? So it's another way of focusing your efforts on the uncertainties that matter. Maybe there's only a small handful of these that would change the way you decided to manage your fishery. Very often happens that of the 100 things that people have been worried about for 20 years, only 10 of them really make a difference for how you would decide to do things. They rank the same. If you have a size limit with this and a index-based MPA, their ranking is constant for most of the uncertainties. There's only a small number of those that really affect how you would choose what you would do.
Okay, and just to follow up with that, so ranking would be kind of like, well, the uncertainties would be like a P-star, evaluation of the uncertainty level of some data into the model. But that doesn't really line up with, anyway, you answered my first question and I got it. Thank you on that one.
Yeah, and ruminate on the second one. We'll come back to it.
Thank you, Jimmy. Recognize Richard.
Hi, Richard Gomez, Lower Keys. So I'm going to use an example of a fishery and then ask maybe a question or two in reference to it. So let's just take mutton snapper, for instance, and during the spawn. We've always had a problem with data because depending on conditions, it's going to enhance productivity or decrease it. So if we took a year, and happens often, where you have a strong east current and a southeasterly breeze working against each other, it's going to decrease productivity because only the people that know how to fish in that condition are going to do well. So the data for that particular season is going to be skewed because there was less productivity, right? So bearing that in mind, you would have to know, whoever's doing the MSE would have to know what was going on, and would that be part of the scenario when you go into the simulation? And then just question two would be, how would fisheries management handle this new tool, seeing that all this new simulated information goes into just that particular scenario?
On the first point, absolutely. If it's critical to the way that the fishery operates, the word that the sort of assessment type people like me would use is availability. what you're saying is that under different conditions, there's a different availability of fish to the fishery. And take the example of anchovy. I just did a review of the biggest fishery on earth, Peruvian anchovy. They do exactly that, and they put it in their management procedure. They take that environmental data and they say, this year's a year where people are going to be able to catch a lot of fish. We should have higher tax. And they test that as an idea. They have to do the thing you've said. They have to simulate it. Like, it has to be in there, and we can do that. So we look at the historical fishery, and we look at what you guys think and what the data tells us about availability and those conditions. We characterize those, and then in the future, we make sure it has those changes in availability. It's really critical. But more than that, we can test rules that could even use those environmental data to make sure that the catch advice, or whatever the advice is, responds to that. So absolutely. On the second point is how management going to respond to this? I have no idea. But, that's a really big challenge here, is to move to a paradigm, a different system, where people are picking a management rule based on a bunch of simulated results. But that's what we're talking about, and I have no idea how they're going to respond. I can tell you how other people have, but in this setting, I don't know.
Yes, so just one more quick thing. So management would have to know what the condition was on any particular day if they were going to use your source and implement it into management. So that would be critical into, new rules and regulations coming down the line. I mean, I like the concept, but management would have to use it in an everyday manner, because every day changes.
Well, the idea is that you create those simulations that have that complexity, but the rule that you pick is something that's established and known already to be suitable for those circumstances. I mean, you can have short-term responsive management procedures, but generally they'd be looking to establish something, what was a simple rule that everybody understood, that was demonstrated to cope with the situation that you're describing. So it wouldn't require complicated changes. It would be something we just know works. I don't know if that helps at all.
All right, thank you, Richie. And I just think out of interest here for Tom and Adrian, we represent about maybe 1,000 miles of coastline here along the Atlantic, and also if you first ask your question, might be interesting to state what state or what region you're at least from, just for your knowledge. Richie is Keys, and of South Florida, and just from Jimmy was from Central Florida, or so towards the north, and that might be of some interest where people are coming from. At least we're all a little different depending on where we are in fisheries. Recognize Randy.
Randy McKinley, Topsail Beach, North Carolina. I like what you said about the streamlining and maybe getting rid of some of the stuff. And it's sort of in line with what Richard said, and you sort of answered some of my stuff. I was concerned about the environmental and weather, and on some of the species like the red grouper and the red porgies, and even maybe possibly the gags. It has nothing to do with fishing pressure. It could be any of those other concerns. So it sounds like all that's going to be incorporated in, and it sounds really good to me.
It certainly could be, yeah.
Thank you. Cameron.
Cameron Sebastian, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Calabash, North Carolina. So a couple questions. One would be, how do you establish your baseline, assuming the baseline is where everything goes from? That's question one. Two, once the baseline is established, the information that are coming from the 1,000 miles of coastline, your system is going to be able to plug that in the loop for real-time information that's put into the process.
So the idea is that whatever the real management system is, take what you do today. I presume it's annual data entering a model and managers deciding some advice based on that model. It doesn't have to be real time. It could just represent what people are proposing to do. So we would try and simulate the data at the level at which it's it's interpreted by the managers, basically. So that could originate from daily records and daily things like that. But in actual fact, the way it's interpreted is on aggregate. It's like an annual data set. We can get into the details on this later. But certainly we're going to try and recreate the real data that are observed for these fisheries, yes. But whether or not that's interpreted real time is about whether or not your management would use real time data. I don't think right now they do, right?
Yeah, I guess my question was, is the real-time data would be like, let's say in May, we've got 30 days of fishing and we're blown out 80% of the time. Would that be factored in to models that go down the chain is sort of what my question was, because I know that's not occurring at all now, but could it be just plugged in to your model to say, hey, if they have this many days of bad weather, then they're not going to bring this many fish out of the ocean because they can't get out?
So certainly people have tried to do that. They've tried to deal with their fishery on a finer temporal scale and said, well, look, we have these issues like to do with weather. So I'm interpreting blown out as bad weather preventing fishing. It's just, but yeah, that does happen. The question or not is whether or not managers would ever adopt a rule that was responding to that kind of those kind of inputs, because if they won't, then there's no point in investigating them. But we're here to talk to you guys as much as anything about the kinds of things we can do. So I need realistic information about what could actually be implemented by managers, right? You can see why that's important because it relates to these questions.
Okay, and the other question would be, do you have capability of running economic issues in your loop and on a separate thing to say, hey, if management chooses A, B, or C, this is going to be the economic impact on sector A, B, or C?
Absolutely, if you can characterize that. So if someone can provide the data or describe what those impacts are, absolutely we can. And it's another real, one thing I'll tell you is a real advantage of this approach. How often have you looked at a stock assessment and scratched your head and thought to yourself, what does this mean for me, right? And maybe even cynically thought, how can I change this process to get what I want out of it? Because I just don't trust it or whatever it is. MSE, you just say what you want. It could be based on an economic output, and then you say the things you think could be happening, and the calculator just spits out the results. No more gaming, no more uncertainty, no more worry about a system that's not that clear. One of the biggest problems with stock assessment is that people don't fully grasp the process from start to finish, and sometimes those include the technical analysts doing it. Like, it's very complicated. The idea behind MSE is to simplify things. See a simple rule, know that it's going to work, and be able to interpret it in the way that you care about, which could be the outputs of one of these economic models, for example, like how it's going to affect my sector. Okay, and the last question is, so it sounds like your company's coming in as a 1000% neutral entity. I know that as I've sat here for many years, you know, there's always been the question, well, the guys doing the survey, are they sort of really neutral, or are they leaning left or right? So you're coming in saying, hey, we don't care what it is. The information is the information. We're going to feed our information that we run in our loops to your managers, and then you guys can take the information from there. Exactly, it's exactly that. And we would have really no long-term future if we started to try and represent people's views in the modeling. So we stick to the science only, straight down the line. And if that's disappointing to our clients, then sometimes maybe it will be, but that's what we do. So we won't be distorting this process in any way. We're just science-based only. That's it.
All right, thank you, Cameron and Tom. Just a quick process or a check here. For the purpose of the AP members online, I just want to mention, I don't know who's on, we don't have anyone. Okay, I just want to make sure that to let everybody know we're not going to ignore anybody online that's an AP member, and we will get to you. And I have my list here now to continue. Tony, next.
I'm Tony Constant in Beaufort, South Carolina. Along the lines of what Cameron was just talking about, the economic is, in my opinion, is a very important base, not just the boats in the dock, at the dock. I mean, you've got dock prices, you've got the boats that aren't going to leave or will leave, but it trickles down to tackle shops, boat stores, state sales tax. All that revenue is increments that would be affected one way or the other, good or bad. But the question I had was more on your doing the simulation. We know you've made a comparison to pilots and race cars and such. We kind of know how a pilot's going to react. We don't know his exact, but we know the way he thinks. If he hits a crosswind, then yeah, he feels that crosswind. How do you simulate how a fish thinks? How's that snapper going to react to the southeast winds blowing for a month? How are we going to so-called simulate what that fish thinks and will do and act?
Well, the idea is that whatever hypothesis we have for that, it fits the historical data. So it's going to be empirically plausible. And if you put data in there, which has the kind of availability and distribution that you're describing, if that's part of the dynamics, we can simulate that. But the key aspect is we need the data to do it, and we need the hypothesis, which you just provided, to test against it, and then we can establish an operating model that does that. So it's not about knowing per se what the fish does. It's about having a hypothesis and making sure it's consistent with the data, and then capturing that and showing you guys, yeah, we recreated this dynamics that you cared about. It's recreated, and we're going to use that as a test in the future. So that's how it's just the regular scientific process: hypothesis, data, model. That's it.
And with this in particular, with this particular species, regional, like Bob was mentioning, is very important. South Florida is pounded with pressure. Where I'm at, we'll see 6 boats in a month. They'll see 20 boats a day all day. So those are going to definitely affect the fisheries. But I guess they would end up being different models per region.
Yeah, it really comes down to how we choose to create that model and how detailed it is. But certainly we can have that kind of spatial structure for sure. But again, we have to have the data to inform it. And if we don't, then we need to think about how we would use hypotheses for which we don't have data. They're a second round set of ideas that we might use to additionally test management procedures. Then maybe they're not in the first round of things that we care about, but they're there in the second round as something we would also like them to pass. So MSE allows you to include ideas for which maybe aren't that empirically strong in basis, just as an additional test. Like, we don't really think we're going to be flying at night in a thunderstorm, but why would we not choose the pilot can also do that? If all things being equal, why would we not do that? So it actually gives you a framework for building things which are potential scenarios for which you don't really have a lot of data to inform them.
I will say one thing I really like about this proposal is that in a month's time, we can probably do 10 years work of trial and error.
Yeah, and one of the problems with the assessment paradigm is that it's this focus on veracity. It's like, this is the truth, we're going to get the best model. But the reality of the world that we work in is that our forecasts aren't very good. You know, there are assumptions in those models that we don't really know fully what the impact is going to be on, and we need to focus on those which are most important. So the idea behind this is very simple. It's to say, let's focus on the things that matter. Let's get them all in there and see if they matter. A first round thing we could do here would be to get all your pet theories in quickly, very quickly and very coarsely in an operating model and see what matters, so where we should go.
All right, thank you. And I don't know if we mentioned, but Tony, South Carolina, nearby here. Recognized David Moss.
Thank you, David Moss, South Florida. I have to apologize, and I'm going to dumb this down and just say I don't get it. I'm not seeing a huge difference, and there must be, and perhaps you're going to hit this in the next few slides, but if you're going to be getting essentially the same data, because I don't know that we've come up with any other ways to get the data as yet. But if you're going to get the same data that's going into the current stock assessments, essentially, and with the exception of running an implementation model, I don't understand how, like, what paradigm has shifted as this moves forward, other than adding in a bunch of different variables like financial data like weather data, things like that, which are certainly important. But if the baseline data of stocks and whatnot are the same, because I don't see a different way of getting that, I don't understand what's going to be different. And that it could very well be me, but I'm just not understanding it well enough.
No, 100%. If I was in this seminar and I got to hear, I would be saying what you're saying. So maybe give it the next few slides, and I'll come back. And if you're like, I don't get it, mate, in like 20 minutes, we'll talk more about it.
Thank you, David and Tom. List continues to grow. And Andrew.
Hello, Andrew Fish, Central Florida and North Carolina. My question would be, how do you account for, I mean, all your success stories looked like they were highly controlled fisheries, big boat operations, purse seinings, all that kind of stuff. How do you account for the 10,000 boats that fish from Key West to Hatteras, and how are you going to put those people into the equation because it's such a broad number that nobody really knows what it is?
Yeah, that's a good point. And the question is what then becomes what you can enforce. Because can you enforce, I'm not suggesting you do this, but can you enforce areas where people do or don't fish? Can you enforce days on the water? Can you enforce, if you don't know the number of boats and you can't control people putting boats in the water, can you control seasonal openings of like launches and things like that? I mean, I'm not saying you do any of those things, but the question here is what can you enforce? And if you can't enforce the number of boats on the water, you have to use something like gear, size restrictions, things like that. Yeah, I mean, we have the same problem in the UK with a huge number of our fisheries. We have a big recreational component, and we have to use management systems that we can enforce, like size limits, things that you can observe after the fact. Someone comes on the dock and says, that fish is undersized. Here's your fine. That's all we can do, because we can't know or control for the number of boats on the water in our fisheries. So it's not an uncommon problem. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. And this Bob Lorenz, I'm in North Carolina. Just a quick comment. Thank you, Andrew, for that. Because Tom, I had one of the things that went through my mind was that I saw a lot of the examples where these very large industrial abundant cold water fisheries, and we are boutique-ish, and nature of the South is smaller numbers, lots of species. So thank you for that.
Oh, there's absolutely no doubt that this particular application is challenging. But look, if at the end of it, this modeling tells you you need to know that and you need to control it, that's what it is. I mean, and if it may be that the model that you have in your head is very good representation of what's going to be formalized in numbers, and it's going to tell you the same thing. But until you have that calculator that everyone's looked at and set up, it remains a model in your head, and we can't transparently say or come to those conclusions. The idea here is we're just going to formalize all that. So I'm not saying that won't be the result, but let's go through the process of building that calculator, right?
Thank you. I'm going to switch. We have one of our AP members is not here in the room. He's calling in online. So I'd like to recognize Harry Morales. Harry, are you there? And are we set up to listen to Harry? Okay, Harry, you're shown as unmuted. I will try you again. There's 2 more people in the queue. I'll come back. Next is Richard Gomez.
Yeah, so I want to just kind of try and understand a little more, and I think I might be maybe helping David a little if the answer I'm thinking is there. So the data that went into the simulation, I mean, so much of it would have to come from the fishermen that are fishing all the different conditions, correct?
It certainly could do, yeah.
Well, I mean, if it was going to improve things, it would have to, a lot of this information would have to be input by fishermen that fish all the different conditions because productivity increases or decreases according to conditions. So with that in mind, what would happen would be that the council members would have a better view of what happens during each condition. And as we move through the years, they would be able to not depend so much on the catching and the releasing and all the other things that go into rulemaking, but they would also be able to put in the simulators knowing, and of course that it would have to come back to knowing the conditions of each year and of each fishery and of each fish. And I mean, I think it would be a great tool for more fair rulemaking.
Thank you, Richie. Jimmy, Jimmy's passing. Recognize Jack Cox.
Of Jack Cox, North Carolina. Where the problem with assessments are in the whole management system of our fishery is that the council gets behind the 8-ball on things, and it takes so long to fix our problems. In other words, the council puts out fires, and that's what they do. And it's usually we have a problem, and then they're trying to correct it. And so it takes so long in fisheries management to get back on track, many years. And so when you take a forum of a group of what I call experts, young, old, we've got so many different baselines here in this room of our fisheries. And we can very candidly talk about our Pacific areas and our needs and our concerns. And we can take that, and if we have a healthy fishery, but we have concerns like I bring up quite often, because we don't want to see our fisheries closed like we did with red snapper, then we're always trying to get it to reopen. We are the experts of what we do. And we only trust science and fisheries management when we have a voice. And so many times fishermen don't trust science because we are not working in conjunction with our assessments. And when we do that, and we do it with people like you guys that are trying to help us collect data, the only way that it can be done is just like Richard said, you have to take the data that the fishermen are collecting, trustworthy fishermen that some of us have been doing it for 40 years. Then you can start plugging those numbers into the equations and into things that you're trying to do. But and I think all of this has a lot of merit in what we want to do at the end of the day is to have healthy fisheries. And when we can come to a gathering like this and spend time and discuss it and talk about things that you could help us do with our assessments and to make them better and to be more accurate. I've enjoyed working with scientists, and I think that's a win-win for both of us. But it has to be, in any kind of situation like this, it has to be fishermen and science working together before we have a very accurate collection of information to work into any kind of model. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. And Tom, as you can see, something of consideration, I think, for this group, and you can get kind of the gist of it, is here in this region. I mean, we're dealing with 70 plus different species, and our fisheries are very interrelated. Fish occur at the same area where this is basically a bottom fishing fishery that we're speaking about it. And we get into species we can pretty much consider choke species that become a real challenge, where one species actually affects other fisheries and other fishermen. So something, you know, that's in the back here of everybody's mind.
So we'll reiterate this, but I think the points you've made, it was Jack, was that Jack Cox? The points you made have been made before in other settings, and it's basically been demonstrated that what you're saying is correct. What happens is, though, that sometimes there's a reluctance to build stakeholder views into the best available science, and that's created problems with assessments because people don't think their views or their data are properly reflected in the management advice. This system is at least supposed to solve that. So even if the science team wants their stock assessment as an operating model, we build another one which is based on your data. So your view and your perception of the fishery can be built in, even under the worst case scenario where people wouldn't necessarily take those in as the primary model. You say, well, no, these are just two different ways of looking at it. This is one which industry and fishers is supported by their data, and therefore you'll see the impact of those models on the outcomes. So this is a place where we can do that. So we can create models that use or more closely follow the data that you provide, and ones that maybe are based on, you know, conventional assessments that may or may not do that. So that can be there, but also what you think is good and bad can be represented in this. And also you can design propose your own management systems and test those. So you may say, based on the data we've got, we think you should be managing it this way. So the idea here is that you can get all of that in there. That at least is the idea. There's the potential to do it. And you guys will be on our back to try and get that done. But that's the idea. So I hope as we go through this, you'll see that this is it's a different way of doing business, because we can do those things, which we can't necessarily do in that best case assessment, whatever system you're currently using. So let's see. But I acknowledge what you've said, and MSE has been successful in answering those questions in other places.
Well, thank you, Tom. Continuing on with the questions about the concept of closed loop simulation, I do want to give an opportunity again to Harry Morales. He's a near local on our committee. Harry, you're recognized to speak. Try once more, Harry. We cannot hear you.
It's not looking like it's working. So he typed in his question. Assessments are once every 5 years. This appears to be yearly to make better proactive decisions.
Yeah, so one of the big problems with stock assessments, it takes a huge amount of effort to collate the data. Everyone sits around, it's a complicated process. You get peer reviewers in from different parts of the world. No one really follows what's going on. It's extremely complicated. It gets into the weeds, blah, blah, blah. If you do that every year, it's a nightmare. And I've been in processes where they do that every year. The idea behind management procedures is that once you've established the operating models, and those could be like the assessment model, or it could be based on industry data, or whatever it's going to be, you get a rule that's updated and is more responsive every year. And that you've tested it, you know how well it responds, you know when it fails, and you just simply look at the rule, it says this, you get this much this year. So it can be highly responsive, much more responsive than just an assessment that is fitted every 5 years and projected out for 5 years and so on. So yeah, there's a real potential here to build a management system that's more responsive to the data that you're seeing, and could perform substantially better because of that. So that is a real advantage of this, is establishing a responsive rule that's simple to follow, that everyone can follow. You know, TAC has gone up by 10% because of these things. Everyone can see it, we've tested it, that's what we're doing. So that is a really big advantage. And whether that relates to conditions or that relates to the data that you're seeing in that year, that's something else to worry about, but that it could be responsive to those things.
All right, thank you very much. And to keep in mind, we'll continue with 2 questions. I have 2 questions in the queue, but I know Tom has considerably more to go forth, and maybe some questions that you might have might be answered if we let him get back to the presentation again. But I'd like to recognize Andrew. You have a question?
Yes, thank you. Andrew Mahoney, Bluffton, South Carolina. What stocks have you applied the MSC to that haven't had a consistent increase in the MSY year by year?
I'm trying to unpack your question. What stocks have we applied MSC to that don't have an increase in MSY year on year? Well, can I ask you how you're calculating what you mean by MSY and what it means in this setting?
The maximum sustainable yield.
Okay, is that increasing? Is that a concern in this setting that it's increasing or that it's not?
I'm wondering what stocks you've applied your simulation to that haven't increased the MSY year by year.
Okay, so MSY is a really sticky business, right? So in most settings, people define it in a year based on the fishing in that year. So the most recent year, they say, here's the size or age selectivity of the fishery, here's our estimate of recruitment, and then they get their MSY estimate. We're discovering more and more that in plenty of cases that changes over time because the fishery operates differently, or the background productivity of the stock is changing over time. So MSY in actual fact changes in most fisheries all of the time. It's actually a theoretical concept. So I'm trying to understand really, like we've done it in both. So we've got operating models developed that have really big changes in MSY over time, and we've got those that there's none whatsoever because the selectivity of the fishery is the same, all the things that go into that MSY calculation are the same. But we've got others, for example, I mean, take Haida Gwaii up in British Columbia. We've now got 10 times as many marine predators as we ever had, and MSY is 1/50th of what it was even 50 years ago, because we have all these predators out there that keep down the stock. So we've dealt with both situations. I'm more interested in knowing why it's a concern here, like what the origin of the question is.
I want to know what the benefit of having this in reality is going to be.
So, I mean, if you're concerned that there are big changes in things like MSY in the future, what's important is that those are built into the simulation models, the operating models, and we can test robustness to that situation. But also it's going to matter, if that's the case, how we measure success, right? Because if, let's say, the stock is declining in its MSY over time, you've got to judge fishing by that changing yardstick. So your question is complicated because it has implications for both the dynamics that we have to test these management procedures against, but also how we measure success at the end of it. It's actually a very complicated question.
Thank you, Tom. And I guess, Andrew, if you want, Tom, you're through the day here, correct?
Yeah, we're here all day.
And if there's Andrew, if you have the question being somewhat complicated, you may want to talk one-on-one, and we can come back and comment a little later at the end of the presentation or later. Want to recognize Richard.
Hi, Richard Gomez, Lower Keys. So I think this question is a little simpler, but big for you. If you look around the room, you're going to see people that fish for 50 plus species. And a lot of these species, we fish in different regions, but the same fish. Now that same fish will feed differently depending on the region. So not only will you be dealing with more species than ever before, you'll also be dealing with different regions that fish the same species. I mean, can you get that big where you could handle that kind of input? Because the input would be, in my opinion, like nothing you've ever done before.
Yeah, there's no doubt that this is a complicated spatial multi-species, multi-fleet fishery. This is as complicated basically as MSE gets, so I acknowledge that. We have 2 years on this. The priority here is to get to the species that are on the priority list and deal with the dynamics that are the most important. So that might be 10 species, 5 species, I don't know what it would be, and it could be quite complicated or quite simple spatial structure, but we need the data to inform that. So what's really important here is that we get the priority species, the things that are the biggest pinch points or the biggest concerns in the model, and we deal with the dynamics as appropriately as we can given the time horizons that we've got. Yes, it's going to be challenging, but I think one thing to remind the group is we have to be focused. All this is being produced in open source software that people can work with in the future. It's not our stuff, it's just going to be freely available at the end of this. So what's important is we build a framework that can be expanded on, built upon, made more complicated or not. This is the start. and we want to create a working model, but we've got to be realistic about how big that's going to be. And as you pointed out, there are going to be a lot of challenges in getting 50 species and like 100 areas into something. So we have to be realistic, yeah, for sure.
Oh, thank you, Tom, for that. And thank you, Richard, for the question. Just gave something important for us all to keep in our minds as we're going through this presentation is the priority list of species, the choke species, et cetera. I thought that was a good point to bring up and something for us to keep in mind. I guess that's what we're here for. I do have one more question, and it's again from outside, online. Harry Morales. Harry?
Yeah, I'll ask it for Harry, given that he's having some issues with his microphone, but will previous assessment failures be?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, it took a while to unmute my computer. So, I do agree. I guess we have to start with a working model, and then it's a living model that's going to continue to get smarter over time. Is that correct?
I hope so.
Okay, and you know, I think of some of the, I consider them failed assessments or at least failed management strategies, like the red porgy that we've been trying to rebuild for 30 years. Do you take previous assessments like that, and you know, the various decisions that were made that resulted in a failure in rebuilding the stock? Do you take that into consideration when you are applying this or are going to apply this to the snapper grouper species?
Yeah, there's a few things we can do. It's usually quite good to include the status quo management so you can compare anything against that as a yardstick. So when you're doing the future projections, you can say, well, this is what's done or has been done recently, and that's how it's going to compare in the future. There's another thing you can do is you can replay the last 10 years, and you can replay it for what was done and what this alternative could look like. So you could do like a kind of retrospective where you say, well, what if for the last 10 years we'd used our new management procedure? What would it have done? So there's a couple of different ways of getting the status quo into this, and those would be two ways of doing it. But I think it's important to have that as a yardstick.
Okay, my second question is, I think there's more than enough agreement on this AP that the various species that we go after are not homogeneous. You know, like I've never ever caught a Goliath grouper, but I hear in the Keys that you have trouble staying away from them. You know, we have no problems catching amberjack up here, and in the Gulf, you know, I was told, you know, they're having trouble with those. So there's definitely a difference in the geographical areas relative to the abundance of fish for the various fish. Are you and can you take that into consideration?
Yeah, there's two different ways we can do that, depending on what's causing that. So one way is to split up your fleets and say, look, this is just a regional fleet that's got a different availability of fish. That would be one way of doing it. But that would not account for regional depletion if that was occurring. So it really depends. Like we'll get into it, but we need to work out whether the regional differences are about regional distribution of the fish or regional depletion of the fish. Because if it's just distribution, you can deal with that as a separate fleet. But if it's, and there's different depletion levels across up and down the coast, for example, then you have to have, that has to be in the dynamics because that's affecting what you think is healthy and what isn't. So we'll get into this, but there's a couple of different ways of doing this, and you can do combinations of that as well.
All right, thank you. Oh, and I'm Harry Morales from Hilton Head, South Carolina.
All right, thank you, Harry. And I guess we'll be returning to you, Tom, for further on in the presentation. What do you need a little time, or we could do a bio break for 5 minutes, regroup? Since there were a lot of questions.
Whatever people need. One thing I'll say is this is singularly the best feedback we've had at the start of an MSE presentation, so thank you for that.
It's just looking at an appropriate time for bio break here. Let's do just 5 minutes because at the end, we had a lot of questions and that may proceed with the next part of Tom's presentation. So please, 5 minutes. We'll reconvene at 10:06. I got 10:16, 10:15. Thank you. Okay, this is Bob. 1 minute warning. Start to tone down. Get back into seats. Thank you. All right, I'd like to assemble and call back to order our AP and bring Tom back, who's going to further explain, I think at this point is, yes, there we are, the difference between the MSE and the stock assessment, which is, I guess, what a lot of our thoughts and questions were about. Go ahead, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you. Always good to compare what's being proposed with something you guys are a bit more familiar with. So we're going to talk about exactly that difference, and it might tidy up some of the questions that we've had, who knows. Yeah, let's go through it. So stock assessment is just like a part of that schematic that we saw before. It's just observations from the fishery and then your assessment, that's it, but it ends there, right? It ends with an estimate probably of current population status, current exploitation rate, and then maybe a bunch of TAC projections or whatever it's going to be. But it stops there. There's no feedback into the system. So MSE, on the other hand, is this idea that the focus isn't on status, which is the end point in stock assessment. In MSE, the focus is on what you're going to do in that red box and how well it performs when it feeds back into the system. So this could be, as we said, an annual rule, and we want to see, you know, how it feeds back, how it can cope with different situations, like how robust it is when it fails. So the key thing here is that one of these things is like in the analogy is closer to a weather forecast, the stock assessment, whereas MSE is closer to testing a pilot. So the focus is kind of different. And the reason why stock assessment can be problematic is because what happens in that red box, people might have very different views about how that should be done. Status could be really different. All kinds of things could be different. Whereas in the MSE, maybe those differences don't really matter. Maybe you can know that your management approach is the right one, regardless of that uncertainty. So they're quite different ways of looking at things. And of course, an assessment can look the same, both here, these pilots, this assessment rules and everything else can look good, but you don't actually know which is going to perform well. Like here we take all our data in, we say this is stock status, we say we're going to use advice on it, but we don't know which one of these guys is going to actually perform well under these different circumstances. So on the left, we have an actual NASA test pilot, whereas on the right, it's Tom Cruise, right? Like he's a lunatic. So they look good, but we don't know what's going to happen when there's these dramatic problems in the weather or conditions. One of these has been tested, the other just simply has not. So Stock assessments are a management procedure. They're just a really complicated one. Generally, we have simple rules in management procedures. Stock assessments are really complicated. They provide advice, but they're very, very hard to test. And for the most part, we don't know whether what we're doing, we can look historically and say, well, we've had problems in this fishery, but if we were to propose a new type of assessment model that was simpler, more complicated, we would not actually know what the marginal expected benefit of that is. Think about it. The next time someone tells you we're going to do this new stock assessment, the question you've got is why? And no one can tell you. They'll just say it's more complicated and we think it'd be more precise. But you're like, yeah, but does that mean it's going to manage it any better? Stock assessment is woefully disconnected from management performance. You don't even dare to ask. You don't expect to get a sensible response. It's like, why don't we do something simpler? Wouldn't it be cheaper? How do you know it would be worse? Oh, we don't know. We don't know. It's kind of shocking, right? Anyway, and we find all kinds of problems with stock assessments, whether we want to admit it or not. We find that they're not very good at estimating current scale. Take your most data-rich stock assessment. I'll tell you what, you could change a few things and it will tell you that the amount of creatures in the water is quite different easily. That is not, I've reviewed maybe 50 stock assessments globally, and I will tell you it is not hard to come to that conclusion. They're very sensitive often to alternative, plausible assumptions. Like you might say, well, yeah, but what about this? And suddenly the thing spits out a completely different answer. That's not uncommon either. People involved in assessment are obsessed with trying to get to the truth. What's the closest thing to reality? So they tend to pursue very complicated models that maybe aren't robust, maybe. And that can create problems where the model takes weeks to run and it's unstable and there's all these other problems with it. But what if your uncertainties in the system are so radically different that they can't even be represented in that stock assessment? That happens, that happens. And so they can, in some settings, be a precarious basis for decision making, or at least demonstrably controversial. At the very least, people can like their stock assessment, but admit that it's been difficult to get through peer review or difficult for all the stakeholders to agree with and things like that. And that is not uncommon, especially when you have conflicts in the data and you have large uncertainties in the system. So imagine you have a situation where your assessment tells you it could be any of these future scenarios. MSE is one solution to that problem in that you can test these things across those different uncertainties. So again, the focus is not on the forecast, it's on the pilot. So the objective of stock assessment is to provide a TAC or some advice, a size limit, or some piece of advice, whereas MSE is to identify not the advice, not the tonnage, not the necessarily that thing, it's the way, it's the rule that you use is the focus of MSE. It's the system, not the, it doesn't say, oh, it should be 2,200 tons or whatever. It says it should be a rule that sets tonnage according to these data. The focus is on the pilot, not on the forecast. So at the end of this, you might say, well, we've discovered that this management system is the way to go. And then afterwards, you look at what it's going to provide you, for example. Generally speaking, although there are different ways of doing it with stock assessment, generally speaking, for the most part, people establish a base case model, which is the best interpretation of the available data, and we focus on accuracy. In MSE, the focus is on management performance and robustness. So one of these things explicitly builds in all the different ideas about what's gonna or could happen, and the other one tends to focus in on a single interpretation. Although, of course, there are different ways of presenting stock assessment results. But MSE is really expressly about uncertainty and not trying to focus in on a best possible model. How do we expect it to perform? Well, we just don't know in the stock assessment. We don't ever ask the question, what is the... a stock assessment will provide you with projections of biomass and things like that, but that's the assessment. We don't know, it could be wrong. We don't know how well this this analysis and this projection and this decision making, this management procedure that is a stock assessment, if it ends there, we don't know how well it's going to work. There are plenty of places where a stock assessment has provided us projections that never happened. And when we simulation test it, we can see why. We don't know how your stock assessment is going to perform in management in principle, whereas in MSE, we do. The management performance, the long-term catch, the variability in catch, the short-term catch, the sporting biomass, all those things, those that could be considered management performance, are things that we've observed for multiple different management procedures. The stock assessment approach to uncertainty is typically sensitivity analyses, and in the system that's estimated. So we say, you know, this is our perception, and this is how our perception changes. And in MSE, we say, no, these are real possible states of nature. They're not perceptions. These are really how the system could be. And we use that to test management procedures. That goes into our simulation. And so it's a different situation. We're not saying that is what's happening in MSE. We're saying that's what could happen. This is the difference between a we think, which is the stock assessment mindset, and MSE is it could be, or what if. Those are two fundamental differences in the way that we think about those things. When you talk about communicating uncertainty, stock assessments, you're going to get variance in estimates. You might get a decision table based on those, something like that. Now, MSE focuses on the ones that matter. Like I say, you'll discover that probably the majority of things that create sensitivities in a stock assessment have no bearing at all on what the decision over the correct management procedure should be. So for example, current stock status could be that it's very healthy or it's very unhealthy, but you would still find that you should be using the same size limit. The focus here is on what you should be doing and whether that changes depending on, for example, status. And so a lot of the scientific uncertainty in a stock assessment is not relevant to management decision making, or may not be. It's quite possible. And so MSE focuses on those uncertainties that actually matter when you're making rules for management. So again, the focus is kind of different. One of the problems that stock assessment has faced, particularly in very complicated data-rich settings, is that stakeholders without technical training, through no fault of their own, don't necessarily have a full understanding of how it works. So the advice that directly impacts them is based on rules, or let's just say a process, algorithms, fitted models that isn't 100% clear to them, and it can breed suspicion. In plenty of places I've been, I've seen stakeholder groups go, I just don't trust this thing. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't, maybe they should, but they don't, because it's through no fault of their own, it's just very, very complicated. But the advantage in MSE is that you can end up with a rule that is relatively straightforward to understand, like a very, very simple index-based rule, or could use some data from that year, and then everyone can sit around and say, okay, now I know what the advice is going to be next year. You know, you can write it in a one line on the slide, for example. And so the difference is that when stock assessment advice is produced, there's a stage where managers sit around, look at decision tables, probably pick something against some idea of yield and risk, biological risk, probably. In MSE, you establish what you think the best performing management procedure is, and then it's generally adhered to. So that rule will calculate that advice for a certain amount of time, and it's stuck to. The advantage to that is that rather than going through a costly, not very transparent process where the interpretation of it by managers is up in the air, in MSE, you know what you're going to get. There's been it's been pre-agreed that this is the rule that's going to be used, and it's pretty straightforward to understand what that rule is. It's not hard to see that in the MSE setting where you have a management procedure, people often feel a lot more comfortable because all of their concerns have been built into the operating models. They're using a management system that they like, They think the handles, and they can understand it. The handles that are being pulled are something that they're interested in. You can see why it could be a solution to some of the concerns that you typically get amongst stakeholder groups when you're dealing with stock assessment. We don't know what's going to happen with our assessment. I mean, look, if we have a climate event, or we have some ocean condition event, or we have, I don't know what's going to be, disease in one of these creatures, or whatever it's going to be, we don't know what's going to happen to the stock assessment and how well it's going to provide advice. We do know, or can expect to know, how our MP will perform. And it might be bad, like it might be bad, like it might really fail under some circumstances. But guess what? We know what those circumstances are now. We worry about the ones that we've shown that matter. We don't have to wring our hands and worry about every single thing that could go wrong. We know it's one of these three things that's going to cause a failure in our management system, and then we can look for those. In general, the idea behind this is that you have confidence that what's being implemented is going to work. So one of the outcomes of MSE is confidence in the management approach. All the complexity in stock assessment happens in the provision of advice. It happens in the fitting of that model and interpretation of the data. In MSE, it can be more complicated because you have to create lots of different scenarios for what could be going on in the fishery. So making the framework has this high demand. But the actual advice is generated, unlike the stock assessment, from something very simple. So complexity is front loaded in MSE. It happens at the start. It's what Adrian and I are going to be worrying about. All happens at the start, getting all those simulation models together for testing things. But once it's done, running the thing and the advice that comes out of it is relatively simple. You know, it's not too uncommon for most stakeholders in an assessment process to feel like they're sat at the back of a room watching a bunch of geeks just talk about stuff that's not related to what they care about and doesn't reflect their views on what's happening. If you feel like that, you're not alone. That has been a very common message that we've heard from just about every industry and NGO group that we've spoken to. If you're not directly involved in coding and stats, you're kind of like a nobody, right? You can't contribute in the way that you think you should be able to. And that's not uncommon. And so, but in MSE, you're the whole ball game because you describe the uncertainties you care about, you describe what performance is good for you, what a good fishery means to you. You can very often describe a management system that you would like to test, an alternative. So you're involved all the way through. And like I say, the technical aspects of it are much like a car engine, very complicated, made by dorks, but really none of your concern. As long as the thing is easy to drive and it does what you want, it gets you where you need to go. Who cares how the engine was built, right? So we'll do all the nerdy stuff, but MSE focuses more on the controls of the car and where you want to go, and less about the technical gubbins of the thing you're driving. Whereas stock assessment's all about that. It's all like, oh, we designed this really complicated engine. It's super efficient. Like it does. What does that mean to a wide range of stakeholders? Not that much often. And in terms of transparency, ever felt like you're trying to game a stock assessment? Like, so you might have ENGOs on one side of the table arguing for the interpretation of some data in a certain way because they hope to achieve an outcome
That question was addressed to Chip Collier.
Well, as far as council staff, we're very for it. I mean, we put together the proposal, presented it to the council, and the council supported it. So we are supportive of this. This is, we think it's a more holistic approach to managing some of the fisheries issues that we're dealing with in the snapper grouper fishery. And if you're looking at the literature right now, there's a lot more efforts going towards MSE than towards single species stock assessment. Although we still manage to single species stock assessment, there's a lot more efforts going to MSEs.
Thank you, Richie. Tom, you have something to state?
Interesting side note is this year the Marine Stewardship Council, our global premium eco certification label, decided that if you want to get your fishery to have an MSC rating, MSC, like a certified label at SG 100, which is their best, you have to have a management procedure tested by MSE. And that's an astonishing requirement, but that's in their draft revision to their standard. It's right there. So this isn't going anywhere because the focus is for them is on sustainability, not status. And the only way of knowing sustainability of an approach is MSE. So they've written it into their draft standard. It's coming in. It's just a side note about this issue of why it's important and it's increasing.
Wow, very interesting, Tom. Tony.
It's Tony Constant, South Carolina. With your stock assessments, we have individual species because we have multiple species we're dealing with. We have assessments on multiple species, but each one. And a lot of us here really feel they are interactive. They basically live in the same house. So with snapper, we are reaching our mortality rate through discard, yet the biomass is still growing larger than it's ever been. And to put it in perspective, our sea bass has dwindled. Our red porgies have dwindled. And just in our neck of the woods here in South Carolina, I'm putting an example 15 years ago. If a group of family or friends wanted to see a fish fry this weekend, well, me and a couple other buddies would run out 20 miles and we could catch 3 to 5 pound sea bass, enough to have that fish fry. So we would have fresh fish, seafood dinner this weekend. I couldn't do that currently if you paid me to do it. I could go catch snapper for that fish fry, but that sea bass is non-existent. And in my opinion, it's because the snapper has grown to the point where it's decimated that fishery, not the fishermen. That fishery existed for years prior to the closure of snapper in 9 and through 14. So in my opinion, the snapper, the redfish, the sea bass as well as the red porgy have both been hurt tremendously by the overgrowth of the biomass of the snapper.
So I think it was 2 years ago, I went through an absolute nightmare process of trying to code those interactions in to make sure that you could make the biomass of one creature affect the productivity and recruitment of the other. And I created a total rat's nest, right? And Adrian unsorted this nightmare. But the point I'm trying to make is that we coded it in. That's all. And we have tons of different options for dealing with that. The problem you've got is that the historical assessments, the rebuilding, aren't accounting for that in their dynamics, but we can account for it after the fact in the MSE. So if you want to create scenarios where you think there's what's called depensation in one creature due to abundance of another, that's exactly the kind of operating model scenario we can test. So these are the kinds of things we're here to hear about, right? Like if that's a hypothesis you want to see tested, let's do it. And what you'll discover is that there will be trade-offs in the yield of those creatures. You will actively have management procedures that actively respond and fish down to productive levels. Some creatures will allow rebuilding of others. We know that's going to happen, but right now we don't have the numbers. We don't know how much, any of those things. So totally valid point, and it comes into that black box of the operating model.
Well, if you look at these species that I was just mentioning, the red snappers are voracious eaters. They just very much consume, and in all fairness, that's probably the basis of their success. That said, the sea bass and the red porgy is now being, implemented in management to the fishermen, but it's actually a product of the fishery. And without a change to this fishery, in my opinion, with the snapper, if we don't allow a catch, then it's going to continue to decimate the other species.
We had this exact problem in BC with salmon, where there's competition for food in the ocean. And of course, they've got this 4-year cycle. So if you allow for, as the conservation groups wanted, underfishing of the big stocks, they actually impact the conservation performance on the weaker ones. So, you've got to campaign for a certain level of exploitation to actually allow productivity in the weaker stocks. We had this problem. It was very, very hard to convey to people. But nonetheless, you can use these type of models to convey that and show them what they are. And there'll be some management procedures that actually automatically compensate for abundance, and they'll be quite good under those circumstances, and others which don't. And that could be a second round test. So what we could say is we don't really know this is happening, but we suspect it could be. Here are 3 management procedures that all look roughly the same. Let's also test those with the Tony non-independence hypothesis. So the Tony hypothesis then tells you that one of those works better. Why would we not pick that? So MSE gives you another way of building a hypothesis like that into your selection of a management option, even though it's just something that's kind of something that Tony said.
It would actually be hard to apply to fishery if the fish are basically eating themselves. It would be hard to apply that into a management with the data of gathering fish by the fishermen, wouldn't it?
I don't know, we'd have to look at it, the data.
Thank you, Tony. Cameron.
Yeah, Cameron Sebastian, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and Calabash, North Carolina. So, I asked earlier, what's your slant or your bias? And, I've looked through a little bit of stuff, and MSE is pretty much funded by Pew. Is that right?
What was that?
You're funded by the Pew Charitable Trust?
Me?
I mean,
Pew and I have a very rocky relationship, I'll tell you that. No, so what's happened was I'll tell you a bit about my background and biases.
No, I'm just saying, my question is, because I'm reading through the documents and it says management strategy evaluation developed by Pew Trust. And whenever, I mean, I'm just saying it's on the document I have. So my only question is that would be, for me, it's like, okay, hey, if I see this great sales pitch and it's bunnies for bullets and I find out it's funded by the NRA, and I'm gonna have a question about that.
Dude, I promise you, I don't know what you're reading. I've worked for Pew. Like I did a study recently to work out whether you could do this for Antrobetta, for example. What else have they paid me to do things? They paid me to do lots of things. Okay, so MSE is a concept. Open MSE, which we've developed and got our funding from, has been funded by the Canadian government, the US government, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's been funded by the Packard Foundation, the Walton Foundation, the Natural Resources Defense Council. All of these people have funded it because they just want the transparency and the science. I will just say, if you knew anything about my background, I literally live 2 doors down from Daniel Pauly at UBC, and I'm staunchly neutral. I will just tell you that. I've taken years and years of abuse from people who I think have got very strong biases in our particular field. So, I mean, it's funny to me because, I tell Pew at every opportunity I can. I told them 3 weeks ago at a Bluefin meeting all the things they're doing wrong. I mean, these guys, they work with us because they know that we're just going to give them the truth or the facts of the matter. And that, I promise you, that's all you're going to get from me.
All right. Well, yeah. So that was my question as I scanned through stuff, and then it's like, okay. I just wanted very clear transparency on that. Thanks.
Nice round there, Cameron and Tom. Enjoyed that. All right, we're going to the outside. I have you on the queue, Jack. I have Harry next in line. Harry? We can't hear you, Harry, and I presume you're typing to Chip.
No, that's, well, I already typed into Chip, but it takes a while for me to be able to unmute. I guess my question, how involved are we as the stakeholders in getting you data that's currently taking place? You know, and I'm thinking in terms of whether it's this year or next year. Are we actually involved in telling you what's taking place, or is it strictly the historical information like what Tony had brought up? You know, 10 years ago when we went, you know, fishing, the black sea bass were so plentiful that sometimes you couldn't get to the red snapper because they were on your hook. Today, and last week when I went fishing, in 6 hours, there was not one single black sea bass, regardless of where I went. But 5 red snappers. So which one is it? The past data, or are we going to be able to give you additional input, or do you even want it?
Well, we'll take whatever data you can provide. Remember that the onus here is not on saying what's happening today. So as long as we can characterize the thing you're talking about, like let's say, for example, we can only reliably get data up until 2 years ago. That's quite typical in most settings. Like people haven't processed the data but we might be able to represent the dynamics that you're talking about in the projections anyway. So it really depends on, you know, this isn't, remember that in an assessment, we'd want all the current data to say what's going on today, and that might include the very latest data that you need. In MSE, we just need to create an operating model that represents the dynamics you're talking about. So even if we only have data up to 2 or 3 years ago, this doesn't stop us from trying to characterize a concern that you have to do with that thing. So it's a bit of a nuanced answer, but we'll take whatever data you've got for sure and try and use it. For sure we will. But the onus here is on capturing the dynamics, less getting absolutely the most current data, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Harry. And next in the queue online are Vice Chairman James Paskowitz. James?
Thanks, Bob. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, James.
All right, very good. Yeah, some of my questions have already been answered, and really one of the most important things to me was, you know, how much is this going to cost, and are the people with the money interested in buying? But Chip kind of answered that question for me, and you know, I think that this entire concept is really fascinating, and you know, for us to be asked to step outside the box and entertain some options like this is, you know, is a different approach. And I think that these things are very necessary. And I'm just unsure how we could get everybody on board to adapt something so new, or would it be something that's kind of underlying in the background, and we would maintain our current management structure to where everything, the output looks the same, but the way we get there is different. Maybe that could be answered for me. Thank
you. James, I guess maybe if you backed off the microphone a little bit, we had a little difficulty with your question due to the audio quality. But I'm wondering, could you quickly and precisely get to what the question would be? We're discussing the difference between stock assessment and MSE, and did you have any comment or question with respect to that, the way we were doing it and the way we're going to do it? I personally, I can see everyone here, Tom, we didn't comprehend your question properly.
Unfortunately, I'm at the mercy of distance away from cellular signal. Is anybody picking me up clearly now?
You're a lot clearer now. Keep it that way. Thank you.
Okay. Basically, what as an overall idea, I think that the concepts are very fascinating for having the data that we're currently collecting and possibly injecting some more data from the different groups, whether it be commercial fishermen or recreational fishermen, and having the possibility of that data being inputted into these models. But with that, I was wondering is everybody with me still? I want to make sure that I don't jump on and off the train here.
We've got you so far. Okay.
Okay, great. Great. Is the current management structure going to stay the same if we did decide to have this company help us with processing the data in different models? Will management change? Will it look different to the general public? Will it look different to the different user groups? And how quickly might change come if we do adopt this new approach? Basically, that's kind of what I was looking at, and maybe you guys could answer some of that for me.
James, I have Chip here, staff on with the council is going to answer that first on this question. I think that's more appropriate for one of us, somebody in the SAFMC versus Tom. Chip?
Yeah, and that's really going to be up to a council decision on how they want to adopt this. Right now, we're going forward with this is going to be used in management. That's the idea. That's why it's being funded. Fishermen have stated for a long time that they want a change in management, and this is one way to do it. It's looking to incorporate your feedback directly into this system so it can better match how you guys envision this fishery. As far as timelines, we have a plan to work with Blue Matter for 2 years. Hopefully going to get an operating MSC from that, and then it might take some time to get it through the management process. So it's not going to be next year. This is not going to be in place. It's going to be a few years down the line, but once it's operationalized, as Tom had mentioned, it could be a yearly adjustments in catch levels or management recommendations. So once we get it in place, it can be much more responsive than our current management process.
Thank you, Chip. You okay, James? Okay. Thank you, James. Jack, you had a question?
Yeah, Tom, that was a very nice presentation, and British Columbia certainly does a wonderful job with fisheries management. I'm a board member of Seafood Harvesters of America, so I'm quite familiar with our Northwestern fisheries, and we also get funded from Packard and the Walton Foundation and so forth. So I trust, the organizations to do that. Thank God we have that funding because this council couldn't afford to do it. And we are looking for a better approach than our current stock assessments because they don't hit the mark a lot of times. Our snowy groupers, red grouper, we've had a lot of problems in our fisheries because of our assessments. Red snapper, of course, and so I think this approach is definitely something that could work with the transparency. The things that I think about are certainly fishermen's input into the evaluation, and how I think James was just asking how much an assessment takes a long time. Our assessments that we're doing now takes a long time to do the thing. It takes 1.5 years to do a assessment in the South Atlantic, and they can only do about 5 a year. So my question to you is, how many assessments could you guys do a year? And how long would it take to do one of our assessments?
So we're not doing stock assessment. Do you mean how many operating models can we build? Is that what you mean?
Yes, sir.
So right now, if you want the assessments themselves to be represented as an operating model, for example, Adrian's already done that for 2 species. He just copies them. So basically we have code that takes a stock assessment if you want it to be an operating model, and it just converts it to the operating model. And then you can superimpose spatial structure, fleet structure, non-independent sequence species, other things on top of that. And Adrian's going to show you a working example that we did this year ahead of this meeting. So depending on the data that are available and depending on the availability of assessments. So for example, you might say, well, we don't trust the current assessment in this regard. We think that there could be changes in the future in this, or historically there have been changes. We can, if it's available to us, we can refit that operating model, just push go on that assessment. We can push go on it with that change and make that another operating model. But the bit that converts it is just, it's like that. So this, how long it takes to build an operating model really depends on how much work has already been done. It depends on, we can fit our own models to data. We have our own essentially assessment type model that we can use for fitting that goes straight into an operating model. The reason why assessments take a long time is because they have to defend every single aspect of those decisions. They have to be able to defend, reference, and every single parameter input and every decision on model structure. All we have to say is not that this was right, which has a huge burden of proof. Like, we chose the steepness value because we just have alternate values for it. We say we think these are equally plausible and they're two different operating models. So it can be quite quick to build operating models because the due diligence and the justifications aren't on this is the best, they are this is plausible. The focus being on this is a stress test, not the truth. And so I can't tell you how long it's going to take us, but it's not going to take us 1.5 years because we just don't have that amount of time. So we're going to try and pick the species that matter most to you guys. And we're going to pick the ones that have the data available as well, that we can condition or borrow from assessments or modify assessments to make operating models. And we should be able to, in a year, we hope to have a working model for the most sort of priority species. So like I say, because the onus is not on defending in front of a peer review panel one model, it's just on making sure that the group of models represent a range of plausible scenarios. The onus is actually less in some ways, if that makes sense.
Well, so you're saying you don't have a peer review with your evaluations?
You would, but the nature of that peer review is not on why did you choose that value for that parameter. It's on, are these alternative operating models, values for that, plausible and worth testing a management procedure for? And that's a completely different question. If you ask me what steepness should be, how resilient a stock should be, what's true, I think that's very hard to get. I think that takes a lot of justification. But if you told me it could be between here and here, and we tested our management procedure for those two values, I might go, that sounds reasonable. So it's a different focus. It's not on veracity, it's on robustness and a range of uncertainty. So it can be easier to do, but you still need a peer review probably. You probably still need some independent experts to come in and say, we think this process was done correctly.
Okay. What do you do with uncertainties in recreational fisheries?
Let's talk about it.
Yeah, that's a huge one for us. That's where we are today.
The question is, would be less how do you deal with it, but how would you scope scenarios for it? Like how would you? My concern is I could tell you how you would do it. I could describe, but the question is the actual scenarios, how you would choose the ranges for those things. That's the question here. Like, what data or information or expert judgment would you bring to bear to say that there could be this many boat days or this view, or they could go up by this much between years or down by this much, or whatever the dynamic is. What we've got to do is we've got to not know what it is. We've got to know what the range of values could be. And the question is what data and expert judgment you can bring to bear on that. Because we could have a highly uncertain, high recreational impact operating model, and we could have a highly uncertain but relatively low impact recreational operating model. I mean, those could be two scenarios, but the question is, roughly speaking, how do we get to those two scenarios?
My last question. Do you have any examples of U.S. fisheries that you guys have done the evaluation for?
So we did San Francisco Bay herring. We've done, I've been working on a joint stock, a transboundary stock for haddock. The original simulation structure behind this, I think, was used for doing quite simple data limited type of management procedure evaluation for things like blue line tilefish and things like that. But you are probably our first, and maybe even the first, multi-stock, multi-fleet MSE of this type with a recreational commercial. I don't think it's ever really been done convincingly before. We've got halibut. What happened with halibut, California halibut? Yeah, I'm also working on California halibut this year, deriving a bag limit algorithm for them so they can work out what their bag limit should be. So we're working with those guys, and that's split recreational, commercial. But in terms of completed MSE, did they get to a management procedure yet for California halibut? So Adrian, just for people offline, Adrian's just clarifying that for barred sea bass, California halibut, and what was it, the other one? Surf perch. Yeah, California Department of Fish and Wildlife have gone through this process. And so they're basically, whether they've implemented the management procedure yet, they've done this. And what we can do, if you want the documentation and stuff, we can just provide that to you. You can read up about how they did it. But no, I mean, and actually the US is, compared to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the US has actually been relatively slow in uptake of MSE. So there haven't been that many. One on this coast you could look at was mackerel, but I think Atlantic mackerel was contentious, from what I can hear. I think that was challenging.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tom. I see no more questions from the AP, but I was just wondering, Chip, the question that Jack asked with respect to the input of the data that would come around the effort from the recreational in the group, the recreation part of it. Did you have any thoughts on that might add just to start thinking? I mean, in eliciting the help of Tom and his model, obviously we use MRIP and we have the intercepts and things like that. Do you want to make a comment or so just to give us a little more in our brain without, and AP, please, we're not pinning Chip to anything. Thank you.
Well, I mean, this issue of data uncertainty has come up a lot in MSEs in the past, and there have been some that looked at the benefits of increasing the precision of recreational estimates. And it's been done for a couple different stocks. I'm just not, it's been a while since I looked at it, so I don't have them right offhand, but I'll look up that information and get it to you. I mean, there's definitely a benefit of increasing increasing the precision of your estimates, and especially for a stock that can have volatile catch levels come out of it. So we can definitely think about it and how to address it, and look at potentially other MSEs on how they incorporated that information and what their goal was.
Thank you, Chip. Tom, a lot of what this looked like for me is from my days of industry and manufacturing, a statistical process control somewhere in it. Instead of having this straight line, we'd have an operator adjust the dial, and every time you got this little range, you kind of work with upper and lower limits. Reminds me a lot of that. And
yeah,
perfection is a little more a range rather than a straight line number.
And that comes under a subject called control systems theory, which basically is the origins of this. So you're exactly on the money.
Thank you, Jimmy. Recognize you.
Yeah, something that may interest the other AP members. I know the Mid-Atlantic just completed a MSE on the recreational summer flounder. I don't know exactly who did it here. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but it was sent to me. It was from their August 2022 council meeting. So maybe I'll send it to you. Okay. And it's completed. And so I don't know who conducted it, but it was a recreational summer flounder management strategy evaluation.
Thank you, Jimmy. Tom, you have another section on this?
I'm afraid so. You guys are sick to death of me. I'm sorry. That was useful. though.
And we've got 35 minutes, but it's going well. Like the quality of the questions are wonderful and the tamped down level of emotion is fantastic. So if we keep going.
I was just, a point was made about a sales pitch, and I really feel that way giving this to you, and I'm sorry about that, because I hate it when people talk about what they're doing. It makes it sound like they're like giving you only like the rosy picture of the thing. But Adrian and I left academia about 3 years ago because we were sick to death of just the BS with academia, and we couldn't think of a way of solving what we thought were actual management problems. We located this idea as the way that we felt happy about working as scientists with fisheries, because it was just open. So if we sound evangelical and like we're like crazy, it's not so much a sales pitch as it is just like where we've basically got to ourselves. So anyway, but I'm happy to debate the merits of it more thoroughly over drinks or something. If people want to get drunk and talk about MSE, maybe you'll get a different viewpoint. So the one thing you want to do when you start off, we're going to talk about the process of MSE, but one thing you want to start off with is a very clear problem statement. Like, why the heck are you doing this thing? Like, what's the problem? Because maybe you do have a good assessment. Maybe everybody's happy campers and everyone loves the advice and there's no problem. Then just don't bother, you know. But what's the problem statement? Is it an uncertainty issue? Is it a multi-species issue? Is it a, you think there's future scenarios that you want to know whether your management system is robust to? Sit down, it doesn't have to be today, but sit down at some point and think about what the problem is that you're trying to solve, so that you make sure that when you go through this, you get, you know, the answers, or we try to solve that issue. So problem statement's really important. There's basically 3 parts, sort of groups of people that work on an MSE, and it's useful to have these separate groups because it stops people from wasting time worrying about aspects that aren't really an issue to them. The first would be, here we've got 2, I guess these are the strategists, race strategists, and they're sat looking at the speed and the cars are going at and all kinds of other things like that. And these guys are the people that steer the process. They basically say when the deadlines are, how it links up with management, how it fits into the general management process. You know, these are like kind of oversight in a way. Then you've got a group of drivers. Those are very much people like you guys in the room, people who've got to drive the car. They've got to get it from A to B. They care about the performance. They care about how it's driven because they're doing it. They could be considered the people who, you know, have expertise and knowledge, sort of on track, as it were. Okay. And then you've got a bunch of sort of dorks. That's like me and Adrian and like statsy people. And we build engines and make steering wheels and all that kind of stuff. You know, frankly, you might be interested in how those things are done, and that's fine. But you don't need to be necessarily caught up in the everyday detail about how those cars are built. Your concerns are different. By separating out these groups, you guys aren't expected to like read a textbook on statistics, which is just bore you to tears anyway, and it certainly does me. And then, you know, you can focus on the thing that you actually care about. You know, I've been in MSE processes where there's a big mix of people coming in and out of the groups, and it's quite wasteful because you can't quickly resolve issues at these different levels. So it's important to think about where you belong in this system, or where you feel you can certainly be an observer to any of it, but it's helpful to have this distinction. So we've got a technical group of people that are all sort of model-y type people. And we'll present what we're doing and explain that to all the groups. But when it comes to the nitty-gritty, it's useful to have that as a small group and keep that separation. So anyway, you have these groups. It's useful to establish them. We've already got the technical one. I don't know whether we can make decisions about the other things. Your SSC is a natural user group, right, as well as this meeting. So you sort of have already, we're not talking to a big room of everyone. You already have organization in your, you know, advisory panels and other things. So I think you already have your users, as it were.
Yeah, we had the user set up. So at the last meeting, people volunteered recreational. It was definitely slanted towards the recreational group. And I'll pull up that list of volunteers, but we also have the technical group that's put together, and then the review would be done by the SSC.
Okay. Anyway, good to have that distinction. But what does the process look like? I'm going to follow Andre Punt's et al.'s paper in 2014 called Best Practices. They just called it that, which I thought was great. Every paper I write, I'm just going to call it Best Practices and just say that. But anyway, it is quite a good guide to MSE, and basically a starting point and a really key issue for you guys to think about now, not in detailed terms or definitive terms, but in general, what do you want? What's good, what's bad? Like if you had a good year, what would it look like? If you had a bad year, what would it look like? If you could characterize the next 10 years, what would be good, what would be bad? That kind of thing. Just in the broader sense, be thinking about that. That comes under performance metrics. So we're in phase one still. What should the different operating models look like? Should they have this non-independence between species? Should they have different availability with weather conditions between years, i.e. very different availability for fleets at different times of year and things like that? Do they need that stuff in them? What data do we have to inform that structure? Like just an inventory, we got to do that of all the metadata that's available. Like what can we use to inform operating models and make sure that we have plausible dynamics? And what uncertainties are we wishing to cover? The structure's good enough, the data's available, but the data's linked to those uncertainties. Can we use those three things to define operating models in phase two? So phase one is where we're at in the broadest sense, but phase two makes those operating models. It builds a set, numerous ones, that can explain all the uncertainties we care about, preferably informed by data. So that's just literally just building those things. And that could involve fitting. So you might have a report for every one of these operating models. You might have a report that says this is how well it fitted the data. That would look a lot probably like an assessment fitting report, but it would be there documented. This one fits the data well, and so on. There's basically two types of operating model, and it's probably worth just telling you now what they are. In most MSEs, they have what's called a reference set. That would be all the things that you typically care most about, and they could be like sensitivity analyses in a stock assessment model. They could be the things that have been long-standing, ever-present concerns that you want to show robustness to. A primary basis for picking a management procedure, right? These are the four things we've always worried about. Okay, they go in your reference set. But you might have scenarios which are not necessarily well informed by data. They might be scenarios which are future climate scenarios or distribution scenarios, things which are interesting and you'd like your management procedure to be robust to, but you don't necessarily have really good empirical data to support. Those go into a robustness set. And the principal idea here is that you can get a bunch of MPs selected, a group that will look pretty good in the reference set, and then you also subject them to the robustness set, and why not pick the one that also survives that additional test? MSE gives you probably the only way I know of building, finally, we've always been talking about ecosystem-based fisheries management, climate change. Finally, we now have a system of even though we don't necessarily believe that ecosystem model, it could be Tony's non-independence between species model, it could be some NGOs climate projection, but finally we can pick something that works otherwise the same and pick it that's also robust to this hypothetical scenario. Why would we not also do that? So it's the only framework I know in fisheries for getting ecosystem-based fisheries management implemented, which has basically been a struggle everywhere. So you can also tick off at the end of this and say, we found additionally ecosystem ready and climate ready management procedures if you want to. So that's the division between reference and robustness set. And I would also say we might consider having a reference case, which is a single operating model that everyone feels comfortable with. There's very much a single thing to play with quickly and easily. And that's the one that you could use to gauge against your Magnuson-Stevens requirements. That could be like your best case assessment. It's just one, but I would think about having a reference case as well. You might go through a phase where everyone looks at these operating models and goes, well, that's a load of crap. It doesn't fit my data at all. I don't want to see that. in anything. Or someone say, well, actually, I think that's marginal. It should be half as important as something else. You might just go through a phase where you consider all the options and select a group, maybe put things in a robustness into a reference set. Just go through that process of organizing what you think is plausible based on the fitting to the data and other things. So can they be weighted by plausibility? And also, probably really importantly here, what management procedures are you willing to consider? Like, what levers can you pull? We've already heard people talk about size limits, control of discarding levels, seasonal closures, spatial closures, access. We've got all kinds of ideas going around about what this could look like. Yeah, what are these candidate management procedures we'd like to test? What do they look like? And then we do the thing we've already shown you, which is the closed loop testing. That's just the calculation. That just drops out of all of this, right? We've got performance metrics, we've got our operating models, we've got our candidate management procedures. We push go on the calculation, and then we get a set of results. Maybe at the end of this in phase 5, of course, we've got to decide though at this stage in the testing how we're going to actually interpret our performance metrics. So everyone might have a different view still about what is good or bad. Managers have got to decide something. At the end of the day, when they decide something, you will know why they chose what they chose. They'll say, we were trading off this group against the other and we chose this. Or we found a management procedure that didn't have a big trade-off. That's why we chose it. Or whatever it is, but you'll know why they chose it. Maybe in phase 5, at the end of this, you'll actually adopt it. You'll adopt some rule for management. One thing we haven't talked about is what happens next. You're using this thing, let's say year on year for like 6 years or something before you worry about revisiting your operating models. Maybe longer, maybe longer. But like, how can you have confidence it's working? Well, what you do is when you chose to do it, let's say it was a size limit and a closure or something, you can see what the cloud or the future scenarios for data looked like in the simulation. You can see what you expected could happen. What you can do is you can observe real data and see whether that matches up. So if you start to get data that differs from what you thought you would see, you can say, nah, we're going to ring an alarm bell here. Something is not right. We're seeing data that we didn't expect to see when using this management procedure, and that's called exceptional circumstances. It's an empirical check, a quick check, that the data you're seeing look like the data you expected to see, and that's all happens in that phase 5. And if you do, if for some reason things look completely different, you can say, well, guess what? We've used the management procedure. The problem is that the operating models somehow don't represent what's actually happening. And so you can sit back and revisit what operating models should be used for advice. But in this case, you only do it when you start to see an what we want from you guys, right? What's good, what's bad for you guys? What things are you worried about in the system? What uncertainties would you want your management system to be robust to, and candidate management procedures? What things are available to be pulled, and have you got the data to inform them, and things like that? So these are the 3 in the broadest sense that we've come here to discuss. We've already had actually a huge amount of feedback from you guys. We gave a not dissimilar presentation to this not that long ago to DFO, and it was just crickets. We didn't hear anything from people. So this has been good so far, but that's what we want to get from you guys, right? And so that's the last thing I'm presenting on.
Thank you, Tom. I have one question. I just want to dovetail into your presentation. You brought it up at the end. We have these various inputs into the systems, or the management controls, classic, old style, bag limits, size limits, and seasons. In the past decade or decade and a half, we then moved to things like in-season closures. And most recently, coming on strong, are accountability measures, which is a payback in another year versus this year. With a statistical process control mindset, which MSE seems to follow, and critique my thought on this, what's your opinion with respect to that? It would seem like implementation of MSE would sort of at its foundation be sort of dictating, hey, you got to tone down a little on something like accountability measures because you're changing the dial you might be changing that dial each year of that data, and your input in-season closures is a little more cut and dry. So a little comment on that. It looks like you did a little less with MSE in the various management procedures that we see today.
Yeah, I think that's the idea of having like you're saying, accountability. It's like among season compensation for. Can you explain what you call
Yeah, the accountability measures is if we go over our annual catch limit and that sort of a thing, there is a point at the next year you have to essentially, you pay that back in a forward year. So if we have a given number this year and we go over, besides we used to close the season, but we can also owe next year a much lower, Yeah,
like sort of carry over, all the negative carryover in this case. Yeah, I mean, you've got two options. You have a static management rule with accountability measures that accounts for that accounts for overages and under. It actually builds in dynamic adjustments, but it's using a rule between seasons, or you have that in the rule in the first place using data. I don't know. You can test both. I think they both have aspects of being dynamic between years. So I think you could test both. The advantage of using the management procedure, though, is it's responding to data on availability and things like that. So it's not a fudge after the fact. It happens when you need it, and it would be interesting to see whether that's a better way of doing business, is to be responding to data as opposed to just having this kind of carryover rule. But I think both things can be looked at. Yeah. If you want to test the status quo against something else, we can test that. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Opening up to other questions, and thank you to the AP for allowing me to jump in like that. Cameron.
Yeah, Cameron Sebastian. So when you started out, you said the best way to do this is have a drink with you afterwards. So I'll say I'll buy the first round for everybody in the AP that would like to go over to the bar and have a drink afterwards. That's an absolute open invitation, unless I'm breaking any kind of rules. And if I am, I really don't care anyway.
You're on public record.
And the other thing, does Red Bull sponsor you? I've noticed they're advertising a lot of your ads. I mean, if so, that's an awesome catch.
What's happening? Red Bull or in our webpage? I don't know. It's news to me. You're inviting an Australian and a British person to the bar, so this is brave, basically.
That is even better, because internationally that gets way better.
We'll see how it turns out. That's great. No, I think we should have what do we call it, in corridors discussions. Like, I think that would be a useful exercise. Yeah, and I'm open to that for sure. And also, I'll just say to the members of the group, our emails are going to be available to you. So just, whenever you want to shoot us off an inquiry or a question, just do that. It's not a problem.
Chip.
No decisions would be made at those offline meetings.
Thank you. I was going to ask if somebody wanted to comment on that here. Just all right. Any questions, AP? Going once? Okay. Chris beats you, Jack.
I guess the question is to Chip. Who decides what data goes in there? The guys that think red snapper are overfished, or us?
I mean, it's going to be everybody, right? We're going to have to use some information in order to develop this model. And so it's going to be based on recommendations from you guys, as well as what information is available. And unfortunately, MRIP is a piece of information that's available.
So we'll know like whose data's in and not in. That'll be part of it.
Yeah, and you guys not only state what information should be included, but if there are issues with certain data sets, point them out. Do you think it's a biased low estimate? Do you think it's just some years it's extremely variable? That's the problem with the estimate that's going into it. That can help inform these models and help kind of show the robustness to the management procedure that you're recommending,
Thanks for that.
if that's right, Tom.
Yeah, that's right. So if we have a system where we're fitting models to data, you can downweight some of those data, you can make adjustments to the bias. Those can be considered different operating models, and you can see whether or not they make a difference. I really think a priority here is to build a model and very quickly, I don't want to say quick and dirty, but in a streamlined way, get as many of these concerns in there so that we can test to see whether they have any substantial impact on, and then we can focus in on those things, which are our efforts on those things which appear to be avenues that are critical to determining management performance.
Jack.
Yeah, Chris, yeah, I was just going to talk to him a little bit about timing on species and priorities, and you might have touched on that, I'm not sure, but you know, the council a lot of times will pick and choose to prioritize species for evaluation or assessments. But I think the AP should weigh in on that as well, what we feel like is important in our fisheries to prioritize for these type of things. Yeah.
Thank you, Jack. Anybody else with a question? Okay.
Thank you, Jimmy Hall. So what's the next step for us? Sounds like we've already, let this train out on the tracks running. So where are we at? Where are we going now?
So Adrian's going to give a presentation on GAG and red snapper. He's developed MSCs for those. Basic, not certain exactly which stage of the model it is.
I think the point, we wanted to come to this meeting quite early on in this process still with a working prototype just copied from the assessments, not saying we believe those things or any of those stuff, but just so you can see a working model and see the types of outputs. Because only when you see a straw dog can you poke at it and decide to make changes. So we just want to come to something quickly so you guys can start to get an idea, because otherwise we're asking you to make an enormous leap in understanding what this thing could look like. And so that's all that Adrian did. He just copied the assessment. So he'll talk about that.
Thank you. Cameron?
Yeah, Cameron Sebastian. I've sat on a lot of these boards for a lot of years, and I've got to say that I'm definitely, I don't know if excited, but the concept is very good. And, to me, it sort of comes down to not belittling what you're doing, but, to me, almost no one is like the process that we currently have in place. So it comes down to really, what do we have to lose, which is absolutely nothing. All we could possibly do from what you're proposing is gain, as far as my overall viewpoint. And it could be really, really good for everyone involved.
Well, we certainly hope so, but it will rely on everyone being, let's say, having Cameron levels of skepticism. I think all of you guys should stay, focused on whether your viewpoints and things are being reflected. I think it really could do, but it will depend a lot on communication for sure.
All right, thank you, Tom. And that concludes what you're presenting. I guess to the AP and to the staff here, we're running up about 10 of 12. I think it would be appropriate for us to do the lunch break now. Otherwise, I presume Adrian's presentation could take some time, and particularly with the questions. Can we do this and be back promptly at 1 o'clock? All right. So we adjourn till 1 o'clock. Thank you.